Richard Swinburne is Emeritus Noluth Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the British Academy. He's best known perhaps for his work in the philosophy of religion and is, by any standard, is one of the foremost rational Christian thinkers, philosophers, and is often described as one of the best of the Christian apologists, arguing that faith in Christianity is rational and coherent in a rigorous philosophical sense. He's been visiting professor at various American and other foreign universities and lectures very widely around the world. As noted here, he has a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics with first-class honors and a B.Phil in philosophy, both from Oxford University. He has published a number of books. My first quick count was 17 on various aspects of philosophy and philosophy of religion and philosophy and religion. Some of the best known are his title, The Existence of God. Other titles include The Coherence of Theism, The Christian God, the title with an interrogative title, Is There a God?, which has been translated in various languages. And then I'm particularly looking forward to his forthcoming book from Oxford University Press entitled Mind, Brain, and Free Will. Today, Professor Swinburne will lecture on the implausibility of physical determinism. Professor Swinburne.
Thank you very much for having me. Physical determinism is the doctrine that everything that happens, every event, is fully caused by some earlier physical event in accordance with some law of nature. By an earlier event fully causing a later event, I mean that the earlier event necessitates the later event, not merely makes it probable that it will occur. In philosophical terminology, the earlier event is a sufficient condition of the occurrence of the later event. If physical determinism were true, then every movement we make, everything we try to do, every thought and feeling we have would have been predetermined by events long before we were born, indeed by the structure of the Big Bang, which many physicists believe the universe began, or, if the universe didn't have a beginning, eternally predetermined. But what is it for an event to be a physical event? This term may be understood in different ways, but I suggest the most useful way to understand it is as a public event, one equally accessible to all investigators. A physical event is then contrasted with a mental event, as one to which one person, the person whose event it is, has privileged access. More precisely, I suggest that we call an event a mental event if and only if, whatever ways other people have of learning whether it occurs, its subject necessarily has an additional way, by experiencing it, of discovering this. By this criterion, pains, itches, mental images, patterns of color in our visual field, and all other sensations are mental events. This is because whatever way you have of discovering whether I have a pain or not, I could also use. If you can find out to some extent whether I have a pain by observing my behavior, I could also observe my behavior by watching a film of it. And if you could find out to some extent whether I have a pain by studying the patterns of my brain events, I could also study these patterns. But clearly, I have a further way of learning about my pain by experiencing it, which is not available to you. By contrast, a physical event is one about which anyone can learn just as well as can anyone else at the same place and time. That there is a bottle of water on the table, that there are many people in this hall, are events whose occurrence we are all equally able to discover. Among physical events are brain events, that a certain neuron, that is, brain cell, is firing, that is, transmitting an electrochemical impulse to a neighboring neuron. That is also something we are all equally able to discover, at least after having had a neuroscientific education. And so that too is a mental event. Sorry, that too is a physical event. Okay, so according to the physical determinist, it's physical events, best understood in this way as the public, which are the cause of all events, including mental events, those to which we have privileged access. And it's not merely physical events, but mental events, which according to the physical determinist are fully caused by physical events. And note that it's not merely sensations which are mental events, but intentions, beliefs, thoughts, and desires. Intentions, what I intend to do when I'm walking along to go to a certain place. A belief that today is Wednesday. A thought crossing my mind, it's a nice day. And desires to explain things better, etc. All of these are events of which are, in my sense, mental. They're not all events of which we're currently conscious, but what makes them mental events is that their owner can become conscious of them and others cannot. When we are actually conscious of a mental event, it's what I call a conscious event. So, to take an obvious example, intention again, and spell it out a bit more fully. By an agent's intention, I mean an intention in what the agent is doing or trying to do, guiding or trying to guide his or her movements. By my intention in moving my hand, my intention is perhaps to pick up the bottle of water. My intention in coming to BYU was to give this lecture, and so on. It seems to us that our intentions, what we're trying to do, make a difference to what we do. My intention to pick up the bottle caused my hand to pick up the bottle. My intention to come to BYU caused me to get onto an aeroplane, which I believed would take me to Salt Lake City, where I would be met and taken to BYU. Which movements we make often depends, it seems to us, not merely on our intention, but also on our beliefs. My intention to come to BYU did not by itself cause me to get on a particular aeroplane. It did so only because I had a belief that that particular aeroplane was going to Salt Lake City, where I would be picked up. There are, however, some actions, which we call basic actions, which we just do, not in virtue of any belief about how to do them. I just move my hand. I don't need a belief about how to move my hand. I just do it. So we have intentions, and these intentions, we think, make a difference to our movements. Sometimes it's in connection with beliefs that they determine which movements we make, sometimes on their own. I have privileged access to my intentions and beliefs. As my hand moves, it certainly seems to you that I'm moving it. But of course, sometimes our nerves get out of control and hands move without our intending it. Yet I can know better than you can whether I'm intending it to move. And clearly the same non-basic action, that is getting onto the aeroplane, may be caused by different combinations of intention and belief. Getting onto the aeroplane might have been caused by my intention to go to Beijing and my false belief that that particular aeroplane is going to Beijing. The same combination of beliefs and intentions could lead to the same movement as could a different combination of beliefs and intentions. And I can know better than you which combination of intention and belief I have. Hence, intentions and beliefs are mental events. They too, and thoughts and desires are things to which we think influence our actions, and they are certainly, by my criteria, mental events. My intentions, however, quite clearly operate through my brain. So if my intention causes my hand to move, it does so by causing a brain event, which in turn causes the hand movement. And so more generally, all our mental events which affect our bodies do so by affecting our brains. We can know that because we can know that it's goings on in brains which make a difference to which movements we make, and so if it's we that make a difference, if our intentions make a difference, they must be by affecting our brain. So this gives the physical determinist a more full picture. He says it's physical events, and these include brain events, which determine everything that happens, and they do so, they not merely affect other brain events, but they cause intentions, and therefore, he concludes, despite what I've been saying the last 5 minutes, that our intentions don't, as we suppose, cause our brain events. And we'll see how he what he supposes is happening in a moment. For the physical determinist is committed to a doctrine which is called Epiphenomenalism. This is the doctrine that although brain events cause mental events, including intentions, mental events never cause physical events, including brain events. What happens when, for example, someone forms an intention to move their hand, is that some brain event has caused that intention, and the same brain event. Oh. Sorry. To recap, the physical determinist is committed to epiphenomenalism. That is the theory that although brain events cause mental events, including intentions, mental events never cause physical events, and so never cause brain events. What happens when someone forms an intention to move their hand is that some brain event has caused that intention, and the same brain event has caused the motion of the hand, and that leads the subject to believe that his intention caused the motion of the hand, but that, according to epiphenomenalism, is false. And why I have moved over to here is to illustrate this diagrammatically. The B's stand for brain events, the M's stand for mental events. What we normally suppose is that our mental events, which might be an intention, or might be an intention plus a belief, this and perhaps with a belief, cause some brain event, and that in turn causes an arm movement. We might even think that brain events cause mental events. So we'll come to that in a moment. But we certainly think that it's the mental events cause the brain events, cause that. But according to the physical determinist, that's not right. What happens, according to the physical determinist, is that there's some earlier brain event which causes the mental events, and that brain event also causes other brain events, which in turn cause the arm movement. But there's no downward causation from there to there to there. So he says. And that is the doctrine of physical determinism. Of course, I've still got an intention to move my arm, and perhaps a belief about why it's a good thing to do so, but on this physical determinist model, it's just a coincidence that these coincide with that. It gives us the illusion that these are causing that, but according to the physical determinist, they're not. It's this that's doing the causing. Now, you will know that it's widely believed that quantum theory, one of the two great physical theories of the 20th century, rules out physical determinism. It is a consequence of quantum theory that the position and momentum of a particle cannot be measured simultaneously to a joint accuracy of greater than h over 4 pi, where h is Planck's constant. Since the future position of a particle is a function of its present position and momentum, there is therefore a limit to the accuracy with which future position and momentum can be predicted. This result, the Heisenberg indeterminacy principle, follows from the basic structure of quantum theory, and is well confirmed independently. What goes for particle motion goes for all small-scale phenomena. Most physicists hold that the data explained by quantum theory could not be explained nearly as well by any deterministic theory, and so they hold that on the small scale, nature is not merely totally predictable, but not totally determined. There is, for example, only some physical probability, say of a half or 2/3, that a photon, a particle of light, emitted from a source in the direction of a screen with 2 slits will pass through one slit rather than the other. Or only a physical probability, perhaps of a half, that an atom of carbon-14 will decay within 5,600 years. Normally, these small-scale indeterminacies average out on the larger scale. It is enormously probable that even though there may be, with respect to an individual atom of carbon-14, only a probability of a half that it will decay within 5,600 years, there is a very large probability, very close to a half, that in a whole block of atoms of carbon-14, virtually half of them will decay within that period. A lump of carbon-14 is therefore what I may call an averaging system. The undetermined variations of the times at which individual atoms decay gets averaged out, so that the large-scale behavior of the lump is almost deterministic. And so, of course, for that reason, almost all large-scale deterministic systems are almost deterministic, which is why we can make successful predictions about the behavior of such systems. But there can be systems in which small-scale indeterminacies have large effects. One could, for example, construct an atomic bomb such that whether it exploded depended on whether some individual atom in a block of atoms decayed within an hour or so. Such a system I will call a multiplying system. For these reasons, it might seem that science constitutes no threat to our ability to mold our behavior in the light of our beliefs and intentions, for we could make a difference to what happens in our brains, and so to the bodily movements we make within the range over which quantum theory does not determine what will happen. Note, so we might think, well, maybe the brain is a multiplying system, and so by just making a little difference to whether something happens in a neuron, we could determine what our actions are. So there's no one that might think that in itself gives every reason for supposing that physical determinism is false, and therefore that our intentions do indeed make a difference. But note, however, that if that was our only reason for believing that our intentions cause our bodily movements, our belief would depend on physicists not discovering some more probable, more fundamental deterministic explanation of the data explained by the laws of quantum theory. And there have been attempts to produce theories of the small scale which are totally deterministic. So far, they've not been successful, but one shouldn't be too confident that they won't be eventually discovered. However, at any given moment of time, we must believe the theory best established at that time, and that indeed is quantum theory. And that has the consequence that no small-scale events are fully determined. Yet even given quantum theory, it is an open question whether the brain is an averaging device or a multiplying device. For only in the latter case could some small-scale brain event, for example, one neuron transmitting enough of some chemical to the next neuron to cause it to fire, only in the latter case, only if the brain is a multiplying device rather than an averaging device, could some small-scale brain event cause some bodily movement which would not otherwise have occurred. As far as neuroscience is concerned, this is an unresolved issue, but on the whole, neuroscientists incline to the view that small-scale brain events would seldom, if ever, make a difference to which bodily movement we make. And anyway, they claim that other recent experimental work gives strong support to Epiphenomenalism, and so to the view that even if there were a certain amount of indeterminism in the operation of the brain, and so the brain was by no means a deterministic system, our intentions still would make no difference to what happens there, and so to our bodily movements. If there is no sufficient cause of some brain event or sequence of events, then current neurophysicists or neuroscientists, or some of them anyway, claim mere chance would determine what happens. So, they claim, even if physical determinism is false, its crucial consequence of importance for humans, epiphenomenalism, is true. So I'm now going to introduce you to some of the latest neuroscience, which claims that whether or not quantum theory is true, they have quite independent grounds for supposing that this never makes a difference to that, never makes a difference to that. And so, even if there is a bit of indeterminism here, it's only chance, and it's not us that make a difference to what happens. Now, the recent neuroscientific work, which I'm now going to discuss, on whether intentions cause brain events, and thereby bodily events, began with an original experiment in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet, and some of you may know of this experiment. Libet got hold of many subjects, students I think, and sat them at desks in which there was in front of them a very fast clock, a lot of students sitting at a desk with a very fast clock moving in front of them. And he attached to their skulls an apparatus which would measure any build-up of electrical potential at crucial points on their skull. He then asked them, each of them, to move their hand at a moment of their free choice at some time during the subsequent 20 seconds, and to note the time on the clock at which they formed the intention to move their hand. Libet then discovered that there was always a build-up of electric potential half a second before the time at which, according to each subject, they formed the intention to move their hand. What this showed, according to many neuroscientists, is that the brain had already determined in advance when a subject would form a certain intention, and so had also predetermined in advance that the hand movement would occur 200 milliseconds after the formation of the intention. So it was claimed the experiment showed that intentions don't cause brain events which cause bodily movements. So he said to students, report the time at which, let's M4 be your intention, you formed the intention to move your hand. And they did, and there was always about half a second between that and the brain event which stimulated the arm movement. But then, Libet says, we find in each case that there was a build-up of electrical potential half a second before the formation of the intention. And so therefore, as it were, it was already, he claimed, already predetermined that this would happen and so that that would happen, from which some rather careless neuroscientist argued that if this always happens before that, therefore that never makes a difference to that. But I think you can see quite easily that that, as it stands, is a very bad argument, because even if there is this, as indeed there is this build-up of electric potential here, always before an arm movement and always before the formation of intention, it doesn't show that this by itself produces the arm movement, because it might do so by producing the intention, which in turn produce the arm movement. So these particular experiments, in fact, to my mind, showed absolutely nothing. But nevertheless, new techniques have been developed in the course of the last 20 years for studying inside the brain, which wasn't really possible before 20 years ago, so that neuroscientists are now able to tell you which parts of the brain are most active when, and so to get a lot more information about what's happening in the brain when we are forming intentions. And maybe in theory, as it were, they could discover, or at least it might seem they could discover, certain relations between things that are happening in the brain and the formation of intentions which would seem to support the conclusion that that made no difference to that. For example, maybe they could show that whenever they caused or somebody caused a certain brain event to occur, there was always the arm movement, and only sometimes there was the intention. And in that case, that would show that the intention didn't make a difference to whether that produced that. And so that would certainly seem to show that that made no difference to that. All right. So I don't think Libet's experiment or anything that anybody's ever done since has had any tendency to show that our intentions don't make a difference. But there is, it looks as if there is the possibility that some future some experiment in this spirit might show what they want to show. However, I now wish to argue against the possibility that any experimental results of this kind could possibly be generalized so as to establish universal epiphenomenalism. This is an argument not merely to show that it hasn't been done so far, but it couldn't possibly be done. And here goes. But in order to establish this result, I'm now going to make what might seem to you a digression. But bear with me. Listen to the stages of the argument, and then you'll see why it isn't a digression. To establish a scientific theory, and this is a scientific theory about the origin of our bodily movements. To establish a scientific theory, a scientist needs to show that it predicts certain events, not predicted by rival theories, and also that these events which it predicts occurred. How does the scientist know that certain events occurred? Well, the scientist may be observing them herself, or remember having observed them, or may have received reports from others that they have observed them. These three sources, experience, memory, and testimony, provide the evidence that the events predicted by a theory occurred. Or rather, since all of these sources may mislead, it is apparent experience, we seem to see something happening in the brain, apparent memory, we seem to remember having seen this result of an experiment, and apparent testimony, somebody tells us this or seems to be telling us this, which provide the evidence that the events predicted by the theory occurred. Now, it's a fundamental epistemic principle, which I call the principle of credulity, that what we seem to, that is apparently experience, is probably so, barring counter-evidence. This applies to what we seem to observe in the public world, what we seem to experience as conscious events, and the logical consequences which we seem to see. If you think you're seeing a desk, you probably are. If you think you remember having gone to London, you probably did. If you think that it follows from these premises that this conclusion holds, then probably it does. And it's the second fundamental epistemic principle, which I call the principle of testimony, that what people seem to be, that is, apparently are telling us that they experienced, they probably did experience. Both of these principles have the qualification subject to counter-evidence. You should believe what you think you see, what you think you remember, unless somebody shows you you're mistaken. You should believe what they tell you, unless somebody shows that they are bad observers or got it wrong. Okay. Beliefs acquired by apparent experience, memory, and testimony, then, are probably true in the absence of counter-evidence. Science relies on the applicability of these principles to determine what constitutes evidence. A scientist takes his apparent observations, experiences, and calculations as probably correct, at least when he's looked carefully and checked. Almost all scientific knowledge relies on apparent memory, for example, of the results of experiments or calculations only written up the following day. And for all science, we all rely most of the time on the apparent testimony, written and spoken, of observers to have had certain experiences, of other observers that they saw so-and-so, and of theoreticians that they had done certain calculations. And the wider public relies entirely on the apparent testimony of scientists with respect both to their calculations and to their experiences. Beliefs acquired by apparent experience, memory, and testimony are, however, open to counter-evidence or defeaters. That is, one can have evidence that, despite the apparent experiences or whatever, the resulting beliefs are not to be trusted. One kind of defeater is what is called an undermining defeater. If someone has an apparent experience of some event X, which would make it probable that an event Y occurred, an undermining defeater is any evidence which making it probable that X did not occur and or is not good evidence for Y. Somebody says they had seen footprints on the ground outside your window and they're using that as evidence for somebody having broken in, but then you discover that they weren't around at the time to see those footprints, and so that their evidence that someone had broken into your house was not good evidence. That doesn't show that someone hadn't broken into your house, but it does show that the evidence that they had broken into the house was not good evidence, and therefore that you had no reason from that source for believing it. The evidence which constitutes the defeater must, however, itself also be provided by apparent experience, memory, or testimony. In relying on evidence for the occurrence of some event provided by apparent experience, memory, or testimony, we assume that the occurrence of the event caused the apparent experience, testimony, or memory. And if we have evidence that it didn't, then that constitutes an undermining defeater for the belief that the event occurred. If, for example, I acquire a belief that my telephone is ringing because I apparently experience hearing my telephone ring, and then somebody points out to me that the noise is coming from the television set when someone is depicted as hearing a telephone ring, that constitutes an undermining defeater for my belief, resulting from apparent experience, that my own telephone was ringing. It doesn't show that my telephone was not ringing, but it does show that the noise was not evidence that it was, because the noise had a different cause. Just let me repeat that again. If you should believe your apparent experiences, but if somebody shows that your experiences are not caused by what you think they are caused by, then you shouldn't believe them. If you should believe your memories, but if somebody shows you that what you think is memory was really implanted in you by some malicious scientist, then you shouldn't believe the memory. If somebody tells you something, but you find out that they're not telling you something on the basis of anything they could have known, so you should drop your claim to believe them. Right. So, as with the telephone, a similar assumption, just to repeat the point, of the existence of causal chains, although longer ones than for experience and ones involving different kinds of event, undergirds our beliefs in the deliverances of apparent memory and testimony. If I trust my apparent memory of an event because I assume that that apparent memory was caused by a past apparent experience of the event recalled, and that experience was caused by the event itself, then, in trusting my apparent memory that I visited London when I was 5 years old, I assume that that apparent memory was caused by my apparent experience of being in London when I was 5 years old, and that apparent experience was caused by my being in London. Hence the generally accepted causal theory of memory. Any evidence that the apparent memory was planted in me by a hypnotist or a brain surgeon constitutes an undermining defeater for that apparent memory belief. So too does any evidence that my apparent memory was caused by my reading a fictional story written by my father in which I visited London. Similarly, in believing someone's apparent testimony to be experiencing or have experienced some event, I assume that they say what they do because they are apparently experiencing or apparently remember having experienced that event and have the intention of telling me the truth about it. That is, I'm assuming, when they testify to having seen something, that their apparent experience or memory and their intention causes them to say what they do. In the case of a past event, I believe that their apparent memory was caused by an apparent past experience of the event, the latter being caused by the event itself. So, if I get evidence that the words coming out of some person's mouth was not caused by any intention of his, then that evidence constitutes an undermining defeater to belief in the truth of what that person seemed to be saying. In all of these cases, the counter-evidence in the form of an undermining defeater must come directly or indirectly from apparent experience, memory, or testimony. So, the summary of this digression, and I'll apply it in a moment, is as follows. A justified belief in a scientific theory requires a justified belief that the theory makes true predictions. One, who could deny that? Two, a justified belief that the theory makes true predictions is provided by and only by the evidence of apparent experience, apparent memory, and apparent testimony that the theory predicts certain events and that these events occurred. You get your evidence that the predictions are true by what people tell you, what will seem to be telling you, or by what you remember or seem to remember, or what you see or seem to see. Okay? But such justification, such belief in the theory making true predictions, on that basis, is undermined by evidence that any apparent experience was not caused by the event apparently experienced, or any apparent memory was not caused by an apparent experience of the event apparently remembered, or that any apparent testimony was not caused by the testifier's intention to report his apparent experience or memory. Now, I hope you're beginning to see where I'm going. We noted earlier that what a neuroscientist would need to do in order to show that intentions do not cause brain events is to produce a train of events from before the time when in question, to show, if you really wanted to show in this kind of way that our intentions made no difference, he would have to show that there was a train of events here which in fact caused this, and it didn't matter whether this occurred or not, because you always got this. Now, in order to have that evidence, of course, he needs evidence of when this did occur, when the subject did form intentions. And where's he going to get that evidence from? Well, in the case of the Libet experiments, he gets that evidence from what the students tell him. Why should he believe the students? Well, you always believe students, but suppose he comes to the conclusion that although, but if he believes that what the students are telling him, given what I've been saying for the last 10 minutes, he believes that the words are coming out of the students' mouths because the students have the intention that these words should come out of their mouths. They have a belief that the student who is reporting this has a belief that he's forming an intention at a certain time, and he also has the intention to report this belief. And so he does. Okay? So if the scientist is going to have evidence for his theory, he's got to trust what the student says, because if he can't trust what the student says, he doesn't know when the student's forming the intention, and so he doesn't know whether the intention is, whether this series is occurring when or the intention occurs or when it does not. But the trouble is, as I'm sure you're beginning to see now, that he can only trust the student if he believes that the student is saying what he is doing, saying what he's saying, that the words are coming out of his mouth, because he intends the words to come out of his mouth. That is to say, he is assuming that epiphenomenalism is false in order to produce a theory showing that epiphenomenalism is true. If his resulting theory is true, then he cannot trust what the student is saying, because the words, if the theory is true, the words will be coming out of the student's mouth whether or not he's formed an intention, because what causes the words to come out of the student's mouth are these brain events. So the whole program is self-defeating. in this way, you can only have evidence for its truth if you already assume its falsity. And therefore, it's not merely that, as it were, so far it hasn't done the job. It couldn't possibly do the job, because any similar program would be similarly infected. You can't establish that this is what this happens independently of that by showing that whether or not this happens, this does happen, unless you know when this is happening. And the only way you can know this is happening is by what people tell you, and what people tell you is to be trusted in general, but it's not to be trusted if it doesn't cause the words to come out of the mouth. But if the theory is true, it doesn't cause the words to come out of the mouth, and so the program is self-defeating. Now, for that reason, I think epiphenomenalism couldn't possibly be established in this way, and since it couldn't possibly be established in this way, it couldn't produce any evidence for physical determinism. However, that's not quite the end of the story. Because you might say, well, couldn't we have evidence of a different kind for physical determinism? Clearly, we can't get evidence from the mental because that's ruled out. But couldn't we, as it were, establish a theory which was concerned only with the physical? It wouldn't, of course, be quantum theory, but it might be some advanced new physical theory which showed that for every brain event there was an immediate, and for every physical event generally, there was an immediately preceding physical event which was necessary and sufficient for its occurrence. And if that was the case, if you would prove that, say, this brain event what was necessary and sufficient for this brain event to occur was only a previous brain event, then of course it wouldn't matter whether a mental event occurred or not, because it wouldn't make any difference. If this is, the occurrence of this is sufficient for the occurrence of that, then it doesn't matter whether that occurs or not, it won't make any difference. And if this is necessary for the occurrence of that, then if this is necessary and sufficient, then this is the only causal chain that's operating, and this isn't going to make any difference. It can't make any difference, because if this is sufficient, then whether this is going to happen, whether or not this happens. So, couldn't we, as it were, develop a theory of physics on its own which would show that physical determinism was true? And wouldn't my argument wouldn't seem at first sight to count against that, because after all, we could observe all we need to do is to observe what is happening in the physical world, and we can do that by the physical world causing us to have certain visual impressions, causing us to have certain memories. They wouldn't be memories of our past experiences, but still some past brain event could operate on my brain then and leave a trace in my brain then, which I could, as it were, recall subsequently, even though I didn't recall the experience of seeing it in the past. Nevertheless, it would have influenced me. And in an extended sense of testimony, perhaps you could, as it were, if you saw something happening, that could affect your brain, and maybe you wouldn't even think about it, but it's affecting your brain could cause the words to come out of your mouth saying that you'd seen it without there being any downward causation from the mental. So perhaps we could have evidence, public evidence of all this, without needing to know which mental events had occurred. Well, it might look that way, but in order that the theory should make successful predictions, in order to be justified in believing the theory, you have to believe that it will make successful predictions. And to do that, you have to know two things. You have to know which events have occurred, and also which events were predicted by the theory. Now, although you could know which events occurred without the mental influencing the bodily, you couldn't know what was what the theory had predicted without actually, as it were, thinking about it. And you couldn't remember, and if the theory is in any way a complicated theory, you can't just see straight off that the theory has predicted this. You would have to go through some calculations, and you would have to remember that you had gone through certain calculations. And so memory would come in again. And if here you are at this stage thinking that you've remembered that the theory has made certain predictions, that you think you've calculated that the theory makes certain predictions, you would have to believe that you have this belief because of what you've gone through all the stages which you have seen in your mind of these are the in the past you've considered the axioms of the theory and derived these consequences and derived that consequences and finally reached the conclusion that the theory makes these predictions. And you'd have to believe that you believe this because of what you had remembered in the past. But we know very well that memory only operates because past calculations, past experiences lay down traces in the brain which in turn cause present experiences. So the only way in which you could have a justified memory about the result of your past calculations would be if you believe that you have made these calculations in the past and you believe that they, in turn, have caused some brain event, which in turn causes your present memory of these calculations. So, once again, you'd have to believe there's a downward causation from the mental to the physical if you are to trust your belief about what the theory predicts. And that, of course, is ruled out by the theory itself. If you are to depend on what the scientist tells you he's calculated, then, of course, that's rather more obvious the case, that you can only do that if you think that the words are coming out of the scientist's mouth because he intends that they should. But if you believe that the theory makes certain predictions because the scientist tells you he makes these predictions, then you believe it because you believe that the scientist's intentions and beliefs are causing the words to come out of his mouth. And if you believe that, then you believe that the sole cause of the brain events is not previous brain events, but also mental events, the scientist's beliefs about the result of his calculations. So, even if you were to try and prove physical determinism not by a route of Libet-type experiments, which require a knowledge of when particular mental events occur, but merely, you think, on the basis of observing physical events, you'd have to know what your physical theory, you'd have to think that certain observations of brain events make some theory probable, and your evidence for that will have to be that the theory predicts those brain events. But you have to know which brain events the theory predicts. The only way of knowing which brain events the theory predicts is to work it out. If you're going to work it out by yourself, you'll have to rely on your past memory. If your past memory, you can only rely on your past memory of your previous calculations if they stretch back more than a minute or two, because you think the past memory causes the brain event, some brain event which is a trace of it, which causes your present conclusion. If you rely on other scientists, then again you are assuming that what comes out of the scientist's mouth is caused by the scientist's intentions and beliefs. So once again, you're in the same position, that even if you try and establish a theory of physical determinism by simply studying physical events, forget the mental events, you can't do it because the justification for the theory depends on you having a belief about what the theory predicts, and that the theory predicts those events. You can only have a justified belief in that if you make an assumption about somebody else's calculations or your own affecting brain events. But once again, you can only prove the theory to be true if you assume that in certain respects it's false. And so you're in the same position. So this is a general demonstration, not merely that certain experiments haven't shown it yet. It's a demonstration, or purports to be, and I'm open to objections in a moment, that no evidence could possibly ever show that physical determinism is false, because the very standards for assessing evidence itself ruled out the possibility of getting the sort of evidence which would show that. So my conclusion is not merely that physical determinism is false, but it couldn't possibly be shown to be true. Now, that does, of course, leave out something that I'm not going to discuss, which is equally important, and that is whether, even though physical determinism couldn't possibly be believed, nevertheless, perhaps psychophysical determinism is true. That is to say, perhaps our intentions themselves are caused by brain events which cause this. I think there are similar difficulties in the face of that program of a slightly different kind. But I'm only meant to be lecturing on one topic today, and so I'm afraid I'm not going to discuss this. At the end of your handout, there is a very brief account of why I think that even psychophysical determinism couldn't possibly be shown to be true for rather different sorts of reasons. But showing that physical determinism couldn't possibly be true is a first stage, and a very important first stage, to showing that no form of determinism could possibly be shown to be true. Now you may say, well, perhaps it can't be shown to be true, but maybe it's true after all, even if it can't be shown to be true. Well, that's logically possible, but if what I said about the principle of credulity and the principle of testimony is correct, then we can go a step further. That is to say, we are always right to believe that things are the way they seem to be in the absence of counter-evidence. And it certainly seems to us that our intentions and beliefs are making a difference to what we do. If we think that our intentions and beliefs didn't make a difference to what we do, we would cease to form them. Our intentions include what we try to do. So there wouldn't be any point in trying to do anything if we thought that trying to do anything made no difference to what happened. And so we would just freeze. It's always rational to believe that things are as they seem to be in the absence of counter-evidence. It does seem to us that we do what we do, not always, but much of the time, because we intend to do that sort of thing, and that's why we do it. You're here because you intended to be here. That's why you moved your bodies in this direction. And it's rational to believe that's the case unless anybody can show you there's been some illusion. What my argument's designed to show is that the sort of work that Libet and all his followers have produced couldn't possibly show that, and therefore it couldn't possibly show any form of physical determinism. And so we should believe that things are indeed as they seem to be, that our intentions make a difference to our bodily movements. I apologize for not going on to part 2 of that, but showing that nothing, not going on to part 2 and showing that we can't believe our intentions are uncaused. We can't rationally believe our intentions are totally caused by brain events. I think that can also be shown, but at any rate, this is the first step, and therefore we are rational to believe that things are as they seem to be, that we make a difference to our bodies through our intentions, beliefs, and other mental events. And at that point, I'm open to objections.
So you say we should believe what seems to be the case without any counter evidence, but since physicalism can't be shown to be true and it can't be falsified either, shouldn't we say the same thing about this traditional view about mental states causing physical states is also unfalsifiable and also shouldn't be held to be true either?
What I argued is it seems to us very strongly all the time, with regard at any rate not to our very quick movements but to our slower and more considered movements, that we make them for certain purposes, and that you're doing what you do because you intend to do it. You're here, you personally are here because you intended to be here. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't formed the intention to be here, and that causes you to be here. I suggest you think that. And I suggest everybody in this hall thinks that, and for this reason, this is a datum, that it seems to you that you are making the movements you do because of your intentions. This is much a datum of experience as it is that I am now looking at a piece of paper, and therefore you should believe that. In the absence of counter-evidence, what I've shown, purport to have shown, is there can't be any counter-evidence. We start from the datum. If we didn't have that datum, if you really thought that what you are, the movements you were making had nothing to do with your intentions, you would cease to try and make movements because you would know it wouldn't make any difference. And I don't think you're going to do that.
Well, we may have all kinds of beliefs, but if it's not falsifiable, then it really isn't admissible, theoretically speaking.
What do you mean by isn't falsifiable? Not conclusively falsifiable, but nothing is. But we have to start. We have to have evidence for something. We have to start, and the evidence we start from is the way it seems. All our evidence just is the way it seems. For any evidence, for any scientific theories, it seems to me I am seeing the pointer point to 7. It seems to me that I remember having seen the pointer point to 7. It seems to me somebody told me the pointer was pointing to 7. If those seemings aren't evidence, nothing is evidence. There isn't any evidence for anything. We must be totally skeptical about anything. This is as much evidence as that. It seems to me I'm doing this because of my intentions.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Hi, I wondered if you would comment on the significance or the importance of either physical determinism being true or not. Why is it important?
I think it's important because I think free will is important, and I think it's a necessary condition of us having free will that our actions are not causally determined. It's not a sufficient condition, and I think I'd rather not get into why not, but clearly if everything I do is caused by brain events which I have nothing to do with, and they in turn are caused by physical events that I have nothing to do with, and so on back to the Big Bang, then clearly I am not responsible for my movements. And if I'm not responsible for my movements, you cannot blame me for doing bad things, and you cannot praise me for doing good things. And in that situation, I just don't have free will. Now, I think it matters whether or not we have free will, because it matters whether we can be praised or blamed. It matters whether we are individuals who make a difference to the world, or whether we are just individuals through which past causes make a difference to the world. It matters, of course, for religious purposes. I think the problem of evil requires, for a solution, a belief that it's up to us whether we cause good or harm. If you believe that God rewards people who do good and punishes those who do bad, then, of course, if we can't help it, that would be a very unjust thing of God to do. But if we can help it, then it would be a just thing. So it clearly matters for religious purposes. It matters, quite apart from religion, for the legal system. The legal system of every country assumes that the individual who is being punished, if he's found guilty, he's being punished because it was his fault. It was up to him. But if he doesn't have free will, it's not his fault. So we ought to entirely revamp the legal system so that it doesn't matter whether, so that, as it were, people aren't really punished for what they do. It's just that imposing some sort of penalty on them makes them less likely to do it in future, but it's not their fault. So it really does matter for the way we think of human beings.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. My question revolves around this experiment that you said happened in, was it the 30s, 1930s?
Libet, the 80s.
Libet. Oh, in the 80s, okay. Well, my question is, there was an initial brain action that was shown to happen about 3 seconds before their intention. Is that right?
Yes, half a second, 500
Half a second
milliseconds.
before. I wonder if you'd comment on to what degree the original professor's his command to have them actually have that intention influence that first brain action. If he had never asked them to do it, would that first brain action have ever occurred?
The details of these experiments are rather mired in confusion. First, because Libet didn't have much and psychologists generally, forgive my mention of this, get a bit confused because they tend to muddle up intentions and desires. And when giving the instructions to students, Libet and the others who followed them sometimes told students to report when they first formed the intention, sometimes when they first tried to do it, sometimes when they felt an urge to do it, but clearly they can feel an urge or desire to do it and yet not do it, and therefore that was one confusion. And then the next problem is that the RP, the build-up of the potential, it was only recorded in those cases where there was an intention formed and people did move their arm. For technical reasons, it couldn't be, as it were, it couldn't be studied generally as to when it was happening, and so it may have been happening all sorts of other occasions when people didn't make bodily movement. But they're getting around that particular difficulty by a somewhat more complicated experiment in which students are asked not just to move their arm or not move their arm, but to move either their left arm or their right arm. And then, as you may know, goings-on, bodily movements of the right side of the body are controlled by goings-on in the left side of the brain, and conversely. And then what they can do is, what then happens is that you ask the students to do this, and then there's a build-up of potential generally over the brain, and then there's a specialized build-up of potential after that. If they're about to move their right arm, then there's a build-up of potential in the left hemisphere. And that can be detected whether or not that's occurring in general, not merely only on the occasions when they move the requisite arm. But what happens in those cases is that there is not a universal correlation between the build-up, say, of potential in the left hemisphere and the movement of the right arm. There's only about a 75% correlation, and what that clearly shows is that what the potential is actually measuring is, as it were, an inclination, which the student might have a second thought about, as to which part to move. So I'm very happy with the notion that, in fact, what is being measured is some sort of initial inclination, but whether the subject yields to that is another matter. So I think that's the sort of the present state of. But at any rate, there's a further problem, of course, that if a student's enrolled on this program, then quite clearly, as it were, there are certain rules which he's already decided, already formed the intention to observe. viz. He's decided to cooperate with the experiment, in fact to move his arm during the next 20 seconds, and so, as it were, he's already formed the intention to, as it were, obey the rules of the game, and therefore the game is in no position to deal with students who suddenly decide it's morally objectionable to be involved in this sort of experiment. And that, of course, is the most interesting form where free will comes up, when someone's intentions are, and someone feels a desire to do something which they believe to be wrong and so on. That's the morally important kind, but that couldn't possibly be studied in this kind of experiment, because the moment the student has agreed to come on the program, he's just got to follow the program. If he doesn't follow the program, his results will be discounted and thought as irrelevant. So again, this is not going to establish very much anyway.
Thanks.
That's the present score.
All right. Thank you very much for this lecture. It's very informative. I was kind of wondering, though, what you think about, because you say that free will is really important and it's not linked to the physical brain processes, but psychologists talk about a number of counterexamples of that, like the case of Philo Dibble, where a rod goes through his head and it makes him into an irresponsible person, or the Texas shooter who had a tumor on his amygdala, which made him uncharacteristically aggressive, or you can stick electrodes in people's heads and make them, move their finger or even laugh without them apparently having any intention to do so. So I'm wondering, how do you explain away some of those different counterexamples where it seems pretty clear that physical phenomena are causing people to, or are actually affecting people's behavior without changing their intentions?
Well, quite clearly, physical phenomena influence people's behavior. They make it more difficult to do one sort of thing and more easy to do another. But we've always known that. That's to say, we've always known, take a crude example, that people who have had a meal an hour earlier are not going to be tempted to steal food, whereas people who haven't eaten for 3 days are tempted to steal food. And discoveries that certain things in the brain make certain kinds of action come rather naturally and other kinds not come rather naturally is simply filling out that picture. As I understand it, humans are subject to all sorts of desires, some of them strong, some of them weak. Free will is the will operates in different, as it were, circumstances, sometimes when it's very easy to do the good action, sometimes when it's very difficult. And it operates in both cases, but clearly people are going to give in more in the cases where they have very strong desires to do something. So an obvious, what you've discussed is difference of character, and difference of character means difference of desires. In other words, for some of these people it would be very difficult to be nice to people, whereas other people have grown up in such a way that it becomes very easy. But that doesn't mean they say they don't have free will. It means the locus of their free will is moved. Free will is the ability to choose between alternatives, and it operates only really when we've got serious alternatives. Now, messing around with your brain is going to shift the locus, that is to say, some alternatives that previously weren't serious become serious, and conversely. And we know from, quite apart from that, that as it were, by our choices we make later choices easy, and every time we choose to do a good action, doing good action next time's easier. Every time to choose to do a bad action, doing bad actions next. So we shift the locus. I think the cases you're describing are cases where you shift the locus. But I wouldn't wish to rule out the possibility. I don't want to say that everybody always has free will. Maybe some people sometimes don't, and maybe there are some experiments you could do to a brain which would stop it. But my arguments are designed to show that for those of us who think we have choices, and it seems to us pretty obvious that it's up to us what we do, it's rational to think that is the case.
Okay. So what would you say about compatibilism, where, say, our desires are actually determined, are predetermined, so then our free will is confined by that?
Yes, compatibilism, we should explain to not everybody present may know this, is the doctrine that it's misleadingly stated, I think, as the doctrine that we can have free will even though we are predetermined to do something. I think it's more illuminating to describe it as saying we can be held morally responsible for our actions even if we are predetermined to do those actions. And some people wish to maintain that whether we are morally responsible is just a matter of whether we are open to rational arguments about it or something like that. And they think that the legal system could operate normally and punish people so long as it were as those people could be persuaded not to do this action by some sort of argument. Well, I, as an incompatibilist, wish to maintain that if it's made inevitable by an argument being presented to them that they will change their behaviour, then it's not up to them whether they change their behaviour, and so they don't have the requisite kind of free will. They are not morally responsible. So I am arguing, so I don't go along with compatibilism for that sort of reason.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for coming here, Dr. Swinburne. My question is, like, you were talking about how mental actions cause brain actions. I guess my question would be, like, supposing that, like you said, that we could, like, be able to trust our thoughts unless we had some counter evidence. But my question deals with how can we know that we can trust those things? Like, let's say it was like an optical illusion that we saw that our senses were, like, we were able to perceive it and believe that it was real, but we wouldn't be able to prove that we wouldn't have a counterexample to that.
Sorry, what you're saying, we may be subject to illusions when we don't
Or that
realize
illusions
it.
are being, like, having our mental states deceive our brain states.
Yes, well, we can be subject to illusion about absolutely everything. I don't wish to deny that. The issue is whether we're rational to believe that we're subject to an illusion, and I suggest that we're not, unless anybody can show us this. Some of these books by psychologists on the subject, I don't know if you may be familiar with a book by Daniel Wegner, which was very influential, called The Illusion of Free Will? Anyway, he gives all sorts of examples of when people have been subject to illusion that their intentions are making a difference to their movements when they're not. And he seems to say, well, because these illusions sometimes occur, we're not justified in believing that normally our intentions make a difference to our bodily movement. But that is surely rather a bad argument, because we can be subject to illusion about anything. And of course, Wegner can be subject to an illusion when he thinks he has reported evidence of this fact. But Wegner thinks that he's not subject to an illusion when he's reported that evidence. And that seems reasonable of Wegner to think that. But if it is reasonable of Wegner to think that, then it's also reasonable of us to think of many normal cases, not the particular ones he's studying, that we also are not subject to illusion. If you throw in we might be subject to illusion about anything, then all the arguments of one's opponents that this equally well applies to. And at that point, we must be totally skeptical about whether there's an external world, because maybe we're subject to illusion about that. And since that's not a step anybody really wants to take, they ought to step back and say, look, we should never believe we're subject to an illusion unless somebody can produce some evidence that we are.
Okay, so I guess but if they're able to provide evidence that we're being deceived, then wouldn't that prove that? Where was I going with this? I had this whole thought out and I forgot. But if somebody was able to prove that there was no physiological evidence, I guess, wouldn't that prove that the argument still is valid? That, like, since we are being deceived, by our mental and our brain actions, that there would be no physical reality?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Okay, my apologies. I guess my question would be, but if, answering, I guess, rebuttal would be, but if someone is able to prove that there is no physical reality, would that disprove the idea that that mental states influence
It
brain
sure
states.
would. It will prove that there are no physical states at all. Nobody is going to prove that because the proof.
I agree, but I'm just throwing the hypothetical.
The proof of
situation
that is
out.
going to proof could only consist by producing evidence. The evidence would be this happens, as it were. But if there is no physical world, this doesn't.
Yeah, you can. Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's clear the mic back on. It fell down.
Okay, my question is mostly more of a clarification. Do you acknowledge at all that it's possible for a brain event / physical event to happen without any intentions at all?
Oh yes, certainly. I mean, a lot of things that happen in our brain are not in any way connected with voluntary movement. Sure.
Okay, and so like, you know, if someone scares you and you scream and you don't really intend to do that, then I guess, are you saying that that's where the contradiction comes when they're saying that mental events can't affect at all physical events?
Yes, sure. I should perhaps have made that clear. There are certain cases where, as it were, we react very quickly to something. Put one's hand on the hot plate, draw it back quickly. Somebody says, "Why did you do that?" And I say, "Well, I intended to avoid pain." But of course, that would be a rationalization after the event. I
Okay.
moved so quickly that I didn't have time to form an intention. I don't wish to deny that sometimes this happens, but the point is we can only believe that sometimes it happens on the basis of if we believe that normally it doesn't happen.
Okay, so
Because I can only have evidence that in that case it doesn't happen.
Okay.
On the basis of all sorts of evidence about Brian, when people do form intentions and so on. And then,
So the reason why this physical determinism is so flawed is because they're building an absolute off of an isolated example.
yes, that's right. I mean, they say, look, see what Libet has shown, or at least they claim to say that. Now, why should we suppose that it's any different with anything else? That would be just dogmatism, they say.
Right. Okay. That helps. I was just
yeah,
clarifying.
Thank you.
The lady has one?
Go
Yeah.
ahead. Go ahead.
So I don't know if you addressed it, I might have missed it, but did you define desire and intentions and that group of mental events?
Yes, rather quickly. Said I was using intention in the sense of our intention in acting, my intention in coming to BYU was to give a lecture. So it was the purpose of what I was, my intention was what was guiding my movement.
Okay, so is this...
It's what I was trying to do, you can say. There are reasons why we only use the word try in connection with an action if it's difficult to do the action or if we fail to do the action. You only say, I tried to move my hand if it was rather difficult to move the hand. But in fact, what I'm talking about, if you forget that and allow trying to govern all the intentions we might have, it's what we're trying to do.
So, okay, so I guess, are you saying this is unique to humans specifically? And is that probably the basis of your argument, like, overall? Like, this is just unique to
I
humans?
don't wish to deny that in the case of the higher animals, their intentions make a difference to their bodily movements. But I wouldn't wish to be dogmatic one way or the other about that because I don't know what they think about their bodily movements. Whereas I do know what humans think about their bodily movements. I think I'm doing this because I intend to do it.
I just was...
And by my principle of credulity, I ought rationally to believe that in the absence of counter-evidence. My argument is to show we can't have counter-evidence against this sort of thing. So if we think that we are doing things because we intend to do them, we're right to do that. If monkeys and cats also think that, then they are right to think that, but I don't know whether they think that or not.
Okay, I just I was just wondering what it meant to free will, but that makes a lot of sense. So,
Desires I was distinguishing from intentions.
That's
One desires are one's natural inclinations to do actions on which one may or may not act, and therefore I may, desire to eat the cream cake, but stop myself eating the cream cake. It's still a desire.
So intentions are the important,
The
the
yes,
most
that's
important
right,
thing
yes.
to your argument.
Yeah.
Okay.